And welcome back to Behind the Bias, a history of liberal media. Now, the mainstream media holds conservatives to different standards than their liberal colleagues. But what are these standards, and how does this hypocrisy affect American politics?
There is so much left-wing bias in the mainstream media that if you give them a sword, they will use it, and they will relish using it. If a Democrat gives them a sword, more often than not, they will lay it down.
As a result of their bias, the liberal media imposes outrageous double standards on the GOP. From racial issues to matters of intellect, Republicans are routinely held to a much higher standard than their Democratic counterparts.
They are always willing to forgive Democrats and liberals or ignore the sins of Democrats and liberals, but will never forgive conservatives for what they say.
Now, this double standard is clearly evident when it comes to racial issues. Senate Minority Leader Trent Lott was forced to resign his leadership position back in 2002 when at a birthday party for former Senator Strom Thurmond, he said,
"When Strom Thurmond ran for president, we voted for him. We're proud of it."
That was seen as a tacit endorsement of the kind of segregation that Thurmond stood for at the time. And for many people, those kinds of gaffes or statements or slips of the tongue, those are seen as revealing something. It fits very easily into a narrative that conservative politics in America rose on the back of racial prejudice.
But for liberals, it's a different story. The media was silent when then-Senator Joe Biden referred to Barack Obama as the first mainstream African-American candidate who is articulate and bright and clean, or told an Indian-American supporter this:
"You cannot go to a 7-Eleven or a Dunkin' Donuts unless you have a slight Indian accent." I'm not joking.
When liberals make verbal slips of those kinds, and we have ones from Joe Biden and many other political figures, it doesn't fit a narrative of any particular kind. Therefore, the story is usually reported, but it's not fit into a larger narrative, and it isn't remembered 5 or 10 years later.
Anybody with any smarts who's paying attention says, you know what, this process lacks integrity. It's not equal, it's not balanced. You're not really concerned about race and about intimidation and offense. What you're concerned with is scoring political points.
The roots of this hypocrisy go all the way back to the Civil Rights Movement and the Democratic Party's shameful past.
The Democratic Party has a lot to apologize for when it comes to race. Robert Byrd, when he was alive, had a lot to apologize with regards to race. Al Gore Sr., who opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Sam Ervin, the hero of Watergate. These were all deep-dyed segregationists. And so if you dig very deep into Democratic dirt, you'll be turning over just a treasure chest of old racist comments and attitudes.
And the liberal media has allowed the Democrats to bury this history.
Along about the time that the media went left, they began to assist the Democratic Party in the airbrushing of their racist past out of the headlines. Someone had to be the bad guy in the Civil Rights War. Someone had to take the fall for having had a segregationist South. And with a less than brilliant media, they don't understand the history of the Civil Rights Act.
But perhaps no media double standard is as outrageous as the one surrounding intelligence and stupidity. Dan Quayle was nearly laughed out of office when he misspelled the word potato at a Trenton middle school.
Add one little bit on the pen. Potato. You're right phonetically. There you go. All right.
And vice presidential nominee and Fox News contributor Sarah Palin was mocked relentlessly after her interview with CBS News anchor Katie Couric.
What newspapers and magazines did you regularly read before you were tapped for this?
All of them, any of them.
The default position for the liberal media vis-a-vis conservatives is that conservatives are dumb. So that when a Dan Quayle makes a faux pas, they jump on it because, aha, see, I told you he was dumb. When a liberal makes the same kind of faux pas, the media's reaction is completely the opposite. They see these people as uber enlightened, and therefore it was just a faux pas, and therefore it doesn't merit coverage, and so they ignore it.
And ignore it they have, from Al Gore's infamous inquiry at Monticello.
Who are these people? Well, this is George Washington on the extreme right and Benjamin Franklin on the left.
To the president and vice president's greatest hits.
Chuck Graham, state senator's here. Chuck, stand up, Chuck. Let him see you. Oh, God love you. What am I talking about?
I've now been in 57 states. I think one left to go. When the stock market crashed, Franklin Roosevelt got on television and didn't just talk about the princes of greed. He said, look, here's what happened.
Unfortunately for Biden, FDR was not the president when the stock market crashed. Herbert Hoover was. And television, well, that had not yet been invented.
Someone like Barack Obama can make a variety of factual slips about running his campaign in 57 states or other things without anyone impugning his intelligence. Those are treated as what they are. They're slips of the tongue. But they're not fitted into a narrative that somehow Barack Obama is unintelligent.
With the Democrats, it's a smile, it's a nod, and let's move on. And everybody knows that Joe Biden's the smartest guy who ever came out of Delaware.
Now, the double standards imposed by the media shape the news, and as Americans turn on the television day after day, they also shape the nation's political narrative.
The assumption is Republicans don't know what they're talking about, don't understand because they haven't taken the time to study the issue. Democrats know so much about this issue, are so well schooled, are so erudite, and have the experience to deal with this issue, but most people just can't keep up with them.
Once they've defined someone as either outside the mainstream, a lunatic, or stupid, the circuit breaker throws the minute you see them on television. The ability to persuade is over, and that's really the most damaging thing to a democratic republic, is the inability to hear people who you're programmed to disregard.
Now, given this ingrained bias, how are conservatives still winning elections?
The American voter is beginning to develop a sense of sophistication that they are no longer so easily manipulable by media narrative that they used to be.
So it just may be that the American people are too smart to fall for the myths perpetuated by the liberal media.
Facts are stubborn things, to use that old cliche, and the facts will out eventually. We still win anyway, conservatives do, because we've got facts and truth on our side more often than not.
And coming up, find out how media bias brought down one of America's most iconic news anchors. It's the unbelievable story of the Rathergate memo scandal told by Bush insiders and one of the bloggers who helped uncover the truth. That and much more coming up straight ahead. At the height of the presidential election season in September of 2004, veteran newsman Dan Rather and CBS News aired a story on 60 Minutes regarding the military record of President George W. Bush. Now, the explosive segment would later become known as one of the most obscene examples of media bias in American history.
I don't think there's any serious doubt that what was going on here was an effort by at least some people at CBS News to influence the 2004 presidential election.
Did then Lieutenant Bush fulfill all of his military commitments? And just how did he land that coveted slot in the Guard in the first place? Tonight, we have new documents and new information on the president's military service.
The 4 documents allegedly penned in the early 1970s by Lieutenant Bush's commanding officer painted a dismal picture of the future president's military service.
Colonel Killian writes that Lieutenant Bush called him to talk about how he can get out of coming to drill from now through November. Bush tells his commander he is working on a campaign in Alabama and may not have time to take his physical.
That night, Rather assured viewers that he could vouch for the integrity of the memoranda.
We consulted a handwriting analyst and document expert who believes the material is authentic.
But not everyone agreed. White House senior advisor Karl Rove and then chairman of the Republican National Committee, Ed Gillespie, played pivotal roles in responding to this story.
We immediately went after the credibility of the documents.
I was pretty assertive in calling on CBS News to come clean about all of this.
The RNC and the Bush administration were not alone in their efforts to expose these documents as fraudulent.
Really, this was a time where you saw the impact of independent bloggers and conservative bloggers as well.
This episode, as much as anything, demonstrated to everybody the incredible power that the internet has as a medium to bring information together and publish it to an audience of many millions of people.
John Hinderaker from PowerlineBlog.com was among those at the forefront of the online investigation that began the day after the 60 Minutes story aired.
One thing I did over the course of the day was I put up a real memo from Lieutenant Bush's file, and next to it one of these documents that 60 Minutes had just sort of magically produced. And if you just looked at them, the difference was frankly obvious.
Bloggers around the country discovered one of the most critical failings of the documents, which was that it used a type font that was not available on typewriters of the era and wasn't available until personal computers were invented long after this supposed episode took place.
But it wasn't just typographical evidence that raised concerns.
The truth is these documents were not accurate. They completely misrepresented what was in fact a very honorable career by Lieutenant Bush in the Texas Air National Guard. He got glowing evaluations from his superiors, and they're publicly available.
And it was later revealed that the producer behind the 60 Minutes report, a woman named Mary Mapes, knew about those evaluations all along.
Mary Mapes had been on a vendetta for years against President Bush, trying to come up with this story.
There was an animus against the president, a political animus on the part of Rather and his producer Mapes.
And just as conservative blogs helped the Bush campaign uncover the truth, an internal CBS report later revealed that Mapes and others had some help of their own in crafting this bogus story.
We do know that they were in connection with people like Joe Lockhart in the Democratic campaign apparatus.
It's pretty breathtaking to see that kind of hand-in-glove operation between a presidential campaign and a media outlet that's supposed to be covering both campaigns, but was clearly in collusion with one of the campaigns.
The Kerry campaign started an advertising campaign on television the morning after the 60 Minutes show ran on this same theme of President Bush's service in the Texas Air National Guard.
That was part of their mantra during the 2004 campaign, and if you look at what CBS News was doing in their investigation, it's clear they were trying to give sustenance to that line of attack by the DNC and the Kerry campaign.
Although the CBS-DNC connection wasn't fully revealed until after the 2004 election, the credibility of the network was tarnished within hours of the initial newscast. Even so, the face of the segment in question stood by his reporting.
After the story aired, Dan Rather dug in his heels and he went on television and he assured the American people that these documents were genuine.
They just couldn't step back from it. Having, thrown all their cards in, they had to play it out to the end.
Do you feel like you were duped at all?
I'm very glad to see you. Do you feel like you were duped at all, by the way?
It's a sign of how absolutely blind to his own prejudices and to the facts that Rather is that he would continue to say those things.
Ultimately, the Bush National Guard story ended Dan Rather's 44-year tenure at CBS.
I want to say personally and directly, I'm sorry.
If CBS were, going to salvage some, semblance of respectability as an objective media outlet, they couldn't do that and still have Dan Rather, as the anchor or the managing editor of CBS Evening News.
Despite Rather's departure and the firing of producer Mary Mapes, somehow myths about the president's guard service live on.
One of the reasons why it's so important for journalists to get the facts right the first time is that you can never fully undo the smear. George W. Bush was smeared here by 60 Minutes, by Mary Mapes and Dan Rather. And even though we now know that those allegations were proved to be false, to some degree the mud always sticks.
The people who today still believe what Rather was laying out are basically drinking from the fever swamp.
It's dogma, and facts don't matter. They're comfortable believing that, even though it's demonstrably not true.
And it is that tragic reality that helps put the sheer power of the left's control over mainstream media into perspective.
And coming up next, how the media is rushed to judgment in the case of Valerie Plame incriminated the innocent. That and much more straight ahead.